Today, we will take a look at the Sherpas who knew this grandma was going to die. This stubborn climber, far too old to be attempting the killer mountain, made such a reckless decision that shocked even hardened Sherpas who thought they'd seen it all. It was October 14th, 2016, at 2:30 a.m. on the northwest ridge of one of the world's 14 highest peaks. At 26,906 feet above sea level, the mountain's summit approach stretched across an exposed ridge where winds regularly exceeded hurricane force and temperatures plummeted to levels that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. The pre-dawn darkness concealed the treacherous terrain ahead, revealing only what expedition headlamps could illuminate across the endless white slopes. Above 26,000 feet, atmospheric pressure dropped to 1/3 of sea level, creating conditions that pushed equipment and human endurance to their absolute limits. Marlene Patterson was 67 years old, a retired librarian from Phoenix, Arizona, who had spent her career organizing information with methodical precision and helping students navigate complex research projects. Known among her hiking group for her careful planning and steady pace on weekend excursions through the desert canyons of the Southwest, she had maintained an active outdoor lifestyle well into her 60s, completing challenging multi-day backpacking trips across Arizona's most demanding terrain. After her husband Robert's death from pancreatic cancer 3 years earlier, Marlene had channeled her grief into an ambitious goal that surprised everyone who knew her, summiting one of the world's 14 peaks above 8,000 meters. She had approached this challenge with the same systematic methodology she had applied to her professional life, spending months researching training programs, hiring experienced coaches, and building her high-altitude resume through progressively more challenging climbs. Her mountaineering background had begun modestly with local rock climbing courses at an indoor gym, where she learned basic rope work and belaying techniques before progressing to outdoor climbing on Arizona's sandstone formations. Over 2 years, she had systematically built her technical skills, completing multi-pitch routes in places like Camelback Mountain and the Superstition Wilderness, always under the guidance of certified instructors who praised her attention to safety protocols and equipment management. Her transition to high-altitude climbing began with the successful ascent of Mount Whitney in California, followed by Mount Rainier in Washington, where she first experienced the challenges of glacier travel and altitude above 14,000 feet. These preparatory climbs had taught her the fundamentals of crampon use, self-arrest techniques, and the physical demands of carrying heavy packs at altitude, providing her with the technical foundation necessary for attempting one of the world's most challenging peaks. Her preparation had been thorough and deliberate. She had already completed successful ascents of Denali in Alaska and Aconcagua in Argentina, building her high-altitude experience systematically over 2 climbing seasons. These expeditions had taught her the basics of high-altitude physiology, cold weather survival, and technical climbing skills required for major peaks. However, her experience above 20,000 feet remained limited to those 2 climbs, and neither had exposed her to the extreme conditions found above 26,000 feet, where atmospheric pressure drops to 1/3 of sea level and the human body struggles to maintain normal function. For this expedition, she had hired Mountain Ascent International, a reputable commercial guiding company with a strong safety record that specialized in oxygen-assisted climbs via the standard Northwest Ridge route. The company's approach emphasized careful acclimatization, conservative weather windows, and experienced guide-to-client ratios that had resulted in a 78% summit success rate over the previous 5 years. The mountain summit ridge, at 26,000 feet, represented one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The exposed terrain offered no shelter from winds that regularly exceeded 40 miles per hour, creating wind chill factors that dropped effective temperatures to -60 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. At this altitude, atmospheric pressure contained only 1/3 the oxygen available at sea level, forcing climbers to take 3 to 4 breaths for every step forward, while their hearts raced at 120 to 140 beats per minute just to maintain basic circulation. The physiological effects were severe and predictable. Blood oxygen saturation levels dropped to 35 to 40%. Cognitive function became severely impaired as the brain struggled with oxygen deprivation, and the risk of high-altitude cerebral edema increased exponentially with every hour spent above 26,000 feet. Weather forecasts had indicated a narrow 18-hour window of clear conditions before the arrival of a major storm system that would bring winds exceeding 80 miles per hour and heavy snowfall that could dump 3 feet of snow in 6 hours. The expedition's lead guide, Daniel Patel, a veteran of 12 successful summits on this peak over 8 years, had emphasized the critical nature of this weather window during the pre-climb briefing at base camp. Posted warnings at base camp detailed the specific risks of attempting summit pushes outside predicted weather windows, noting that rescue operations above 26,000 feet were impossible during storm conditions, and that climbers caught in severe weather at high altitude faced near certain death from exposure. Local climbing authorities had issued advisories about the approaching weather system, recommending that all teams either commit to summit attempts within the narrow window or wait for the next favorable period, which weather models predicted would not occur for at least 10 days due to the onset of winter weather patterns. During the acclimatization period at base camp, located at 17,600 feet, the lead guide had noted Marlene's slower than average adaptation to altitude compared to the other 5 team members. While most climbers showed normal acclimatization patterns with mild headaches and fatigue that improved over several days, Marlene experienced persistent headaches that required regular doses of ibuprofen and showed signs of sleep disruption that indicated her body was struggling more than usual with the altitude adjustment. Her appetite decreased significantly, and she required additional rest days between rotations to higher camps, extending her acclimatization schedule by 3 days beyond the standard protocol. Despite these warning signs, her vital signs remained within acceptable ranges, and she demonstrated good technical climbing skills during practice sessions on the lower sections of the route. Dawa Lama, the expedition's senior climbing support, had worked on this mountain for 15 years and could read altitude sickness signs before Western guides noticed them. On the second day at base camp, he quietly mentioned to Daniel Patel that Marlene's breathing pattern during rest periods reminded him of other older clients who had developed serious problems. Sherpas called it mountain fever brain, and when climbers lost the ability to make good decisions about their own safety. Dawa had seen it before in determined clients who pushed beyond their limits. At the intermediate camp, positioned at 23,000 feet, support staff observed more concerning signs of altitude-related impairment that suggested Marlene was approaching her physiological limits. She required assistance with basic crampon adjustments, a fundamental skill she had practiced extensively during her training climbs and had performed flawlessly at lower altitudes. More troubling, she demonstrated confusion about rope management systems that she had used successfully on previous expeditions, asking repeated questions about procedures she had mastered months earlier. Her coordination appeared subtly impaired as she struggled with tasks that should have been automatic after months of training, and her speech occasionally became slightly slurred during conversations, particularly in the evening hours when fatigue accumulated. During the evening briefing at 23,000 feet, Daniel Patel reviewed each team member's readiness with his assistant guide. Marlene's name came up repeatedly as they discussed contingency plans. Her slower acclimatization rate and increasing confusion about basic procedures had them implementing unofficial buddy protocols where support staff would stay closer to her during technical sections. The guides agreed on specific warning signs that would trigger an immediate descent, regardless of her protests. When questioned about her condition by the guide team, Marlene insisted she felt strong and was simply being cautious with her equipment checks, displaying the subtle denial and impaired judgment that often accompany early-stage altitude sickness. She became defensive when guides suggested additional rest days, arguing that she had trained too hard and come too far to delay her summit attempt for minor discomfort. Her determination was admirable, but experienced guides recognized the pattern of behavior that indicated her brain was not receiving adequate oxygen to maintain normal cognitive function. The guide team held private discussions about whether to recommend that Marlene descend to base camp for additional acclimatization, but her vital signs remained stable, and she continued to demonstrate adequate technical climbing ability during daylight hours. Other expedition members began noticing Marlene's struggles during mealtimes, when she would stare at her food for long periods, or forget mid-conversation what she had been discussing. Zara Okafor, a software engineer from Seattle on her third major peak, later recalled feeling uncomfortable watching Marlene fumble with gear that should have been routine. The team's unspoken concern grew as they watched her take twice as long to complete simple tasks that other climbers managed automatically. The evening before the summit push, support staff noted additional warning signs that suggested early-stage cerebral edema was beginning to affect Marlene's neurological function. She appeared disoriented during the equipment check, repeatedly asking questions about procedures she had reviewed multiple times and seeming confused about the sequence of preparations that had become routine over the previous weeks. Her coordination seemed impaired as she struggled with tasks like adjusting her oxygen regulator and organizing her summit pack, movements that required fine motor control and had become second nature during her training. Most concerning, she demonstrated difficulty following multi-step instructions, requiring guides to break down simple procedures into individual components and repeat directions multiple times. Despite gentle suggestions from the guide team that she considered descending to allow more time for acclimatization, Marlene firmly refused, stating that this climb represented a promise she had made to her late husband's memory and that she would not abandon the attempt unless physically unable to continue. She became emotional when discussing the possibility of retreat, explaining that Robert had always supported her outdoor adventures and that completing this climb would honor his belief in her capabilities. The guides respected her determination, but documented their concerns in the expedition log and established specific criteria for mandatory retreat if her condition deteriorated further during the summit push. At 2:30 a.m. on October 14th, the summit team departed from high camp in clear conditions, with temperatures at minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit and winds gusting to 45 miles per hour. The route followed a well-established path along the northwest ridge, marked by fixed ropes anchored to the mountain at regular intervals and maintained by previous expeditions throughout the climbing season. Marlene moved slowly but steadily during the initial hours of the climb, maintaining her position in the middle of the six-person team and following the established rhythm of rest steps and breathing patterns that conserved energy at extreme altitude. Her supplemental oxygen system functioned properly, delivering 2 liters per minute flow rate of pure oxygen through a mask system that had been tested and adjusted multiple times during the acclimatization period. However, by 4 a.m., as the team reached 26,400 feet on the exposed summit ridge, her pace had slowed significantly beyond the normal reduction expected at extreme altitude. She required frequent rest stops that lasted longer than the brief pauses typical for high-altitude climbing, and her breathing became increasingly labored, despite the supplemental oxygen flowing through her mask. The guides noticed that her coordination was deteriorating as she struggled with basic movements like clipping and unclipping from fixed ropes, procedures that should have been automatic after weeks of practice. Her speech became slurred when she attempted to communicate with team members, and she began making minor errors in judgment about route finding and equipment management that indicated cognitive impairment. At 4:15 a.m., while attempting to clip her safety line into a fixed rope anchor point, Marlene suddenly collapsed onto the snow-covered ridge, falling forward onto her hands and knees and remaining motionless for several seconds before responding to calls from the guide team. The lead guide immediately recognized the symptoms of severe altitude sickness. Her lips had turned blue despite the supplemental oxygen flowing through her mask. Her breathing had become labored and irregular, with a respiratory rate exceeding 30 breaths per minute, and she appeared disoriented and confused about her location, asking repeatedly where she was and how long they had been climbing. After checking her oxygen flow rate and mask seal, the guide determined that her equipment was functioning properly, indicating that her condition resulted from physiological altitude effects rather than equipment failure. Marlene remained conscious but insisted she could continue after a 10-minute rest period, displaying the impaired judgment characteristic of cerebral edema, where swelling brain tissue affects decision-making capabilities and self-awareness. She argued with the guides about her condition, claiming that she simply needed to catch her breath and adjust her pace, despite obvious signs that her body was failing to adapt to the extreme altitude. The guide team made the immediate decision to begin descent, recognizing that her symptoms would only worsen with continued exposure to the death zone environment. However, Marlene became combative and argumentative, refusing to accept that her summit attempt was over and attempting to continue climbing despite direct orders from the lead guide. Before we continue with what happened next, if you're finding these stories compelling, please subscribe and hit the notification bell for more detailed analyses of climbing accidents and survival situations. This behavioral change represented a classic symptom of high-altitude cerebral edema, where swelling brain tissue affects personality and decision-making capabilities, often causing climbers to make irrational decisions that endanger themselves and their team members. As the team prepared for descent, Marlene's coordination continued to deteriorate rapidly, and she began stumbling over her own feet while walking on relatively flat terrain. The guides implemented emergency descent protocols, with 2 team members assigned to assist Marlene directly, while the others managed rope systems and route finding down the technical sections of the ridge. During the attempted descent from the 26,400-foot position, Marlene lost her footing while navigating a steep snow section of the ridge that required careful crampon placement and balance. Despite being clipped into the fixed rope system that should have prevented a serious fall, she stumbled backward and fell approximately 15 feet down a steep slope before the rope arrested her fall with a violent jerk that sent shockwaves through her body. The impact occurred on a section where exposed rocks protruded through the snow cover, and Marlene landed heavily on her left side with her full body weight plus the weight of her summit pack concentrated on her left leg. The force of the impact, combined with the awkward angle of her fall while wearing heavy mountaineering boots and crampons that caught on the rock surface, caused a compound fracture of her left femur approximately 6 inches above the knee. The broken bone protruded through her insulated climbing suit, creating an open wound that immediately began bleeding onto the snow, creating a stark red stain that spread rapidly across the white surface. The sound of the bone breaking was audible to team members positioned nearby, a sharp crack that cut through the wind noise and immediately indicated the severity of the injury. At 26,400 feet, with storm conditions approaching and no possibility of helicopter evacuation due to the extreme altitude and weather conditions, the compound fracture represented a death sentence that everyone on the team understood immediately. The support team immediately attempted to stabilize Marlene's condition, applying pressure to control bleeding, using sterile gauze from the expedition medical kit, and attempting to immobilize the fractured leg using available climbing equipment, including ice axes and rope, to create a makeshift splint. However, the combination of severe blood loss, shock from the traumatic injury, and the physiological stress of extreme altitude created a cascade of medical complications that could not be addressed with the limited medical supplies available to the climbing team. The expedition's medical supplies, while comprehensive for typical high-altitude emergencies, were designed for stabilization and evacuation scenarios that assumed rescue was possible within hours. The medical kit contained morphine for pain management, sterile bandages for wound care, and basic splinting materials, but nothing that could address the catastrophic blood loss and shock that resulted from major trauma at extreme altitude. Even the most experienced expedition medics understood that their role above 26,000 feet was limited to comfort care when serious injuries occurred, as the combination of altitude and weather made advanced medical intervention impossible. Within minutes of the fall, Marlene went into hypovolemic shock as blood loss from the compound fracture lowered her blood pressure to critical levels, causing her pulse to become rapid and weak, while her skin turned pale and cold to the touch. The extreme cold accelerated the onset of hypothermia as her immobilized condition prevented her body from generating heat through movement, and her core temperature began dropping rapidly. Despite the insulated clothing and emergency bivouac shelter that team members erected around her position, her supplemental oxygen system continued to function, but her body's ability to utilize the available oxygen decreased rapidly as shock and hypothermia compromised her cardiovascular system's ability to circulate blood effectively to vital organs. 2 support staff members remained with Marlene, while the lead guide coordinated with base camp via radio to report the emergency situation and request guidance on evacuation procedures. Though everyone involved understood that no rescue was possible at their current altitude and weather conditions. Base camp operations confirmed that no helicopter could operate above 20,000 feet in current conditions, and that the approaching storm system would make any ground-based rescue attempt impossible for several days. The team's medical officer, a paramedic with extensive wilderness medicine training, administered pain medication and continued efforts to stabilize Marlene's condition. But the combination of altitude, trauma, and environmental factors had created a situation beyond the scope of field treatment capabilities. The guides had trained for medical emergencies, but the reality of making life and death decisions while managing their own altitude-induced cognitive impairment created an emotional burden that would affect the entire team long after they returned to base camp. At 4:47 a.m., Marlene lost consciousness as her blood pressure dropped below the level necessary to maintain brain function, her eyes rolling back and her body becoming limp despite continued efforts by team members to keep her responsive. The support team continued CPR attempts and maintained her supplemental oxygen flow, but her pulse became increasingly weak and irregular, dropping to barely detectable levels as her cardiovascular system struggled to maintain circulation in the extreme conditions. The combination of altitude, blood loss, and hypothermia had created conditions that would have challenged even a fully equipped hospital emergency room, let alone a climbing team operating with basic medical supplies at the edge of survivable altitude. At 5:23 a.m., witnessed by the two support staff members who had remained with her throughout the emergency, Marlene stopped breathing and showed no detectable pulse despite continued CPR efforts. The team continued resuscitation attempts for an additional 10 minutes, but the extreme conditions and her traumatic injuries had created a situation where survival was impossible. The lead guide made the difficult decision to cease resuscitation efforts and focus on the safety of the surviving team members, who were also at risk from the approaching storm and the extended exposure to death zone conditions. The lead guide radioed base camp at 5:30 a.m. to report the fatality and request guidance on body recovery procedures. Base camp operations confirmed that the approaching storm front was arriving ahead of schedule, with wind speeds already increasing beyond safe climbing conditions, and that any recovery attempt would need to wait until weather conditions improved. The decision was made to mark Marlene's location with GPS coordinates and retreat to lower altitude before conditions became life-threatening for the surviving team members. The storm system arrived 6 hours later as meteorologists had predicted, bringing sustained winds exceeding 80 miles per hour and heavy snowfall that reduced visibility to less than 10 feet, confirming that no rescue operation could have been attempted even if Marlene had survived her injuries. On October 18th, after weather conditions improved sufficiently to allow safe movement on the upper mountain, a recovery team consisting of experienced high-altitude climbers located Marlene's body using the GPS coordinates recorded during the emergency. The coroner's examination determined that the primary cause of death was high-altitude cerebral edema, with contributing factors including compound fracture of the left femur, hypovolemic shock, and severe hypothermia. Blood samples showed oxygen saturation levels consistent with severe altitude sickness, confirming that Marlene had been suffering from significant physiological impairment before the fall that caused her fatal injuries. Marlene's remains were quietly repatriated to Phoenix, where her daughter Rebecca made arrangements for cremation according to her mother's wishes. The family held no public service, choosing instead to scatter her ashes at a favorite hiking spot in the Superstition Mountains, where Marlene had trained for her expeditions. Her climbing gear was donated to a local mountaineering club, and her detailed training journals were kept by her daughter as a record of her mother's methodical approach to pursuing her dreams, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here